We have an amazing roster of speakers today, and we don't have very much time. So I'm very happy to pass this over to our moderator today, Dauda Sese, from Refugee Congress delegate from Louisiana. Dauda?
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you to our wonderful speakers. I'm honored to be here today. And my name is Dauda Sese, the Vice Chair for Refugee Congress Board and President of the Louisiana Organization for Refugees and Immigrants. I welcome you all to this significant virtual dinner table dialogue. So just bear in mind that we're gonna have a dinner table dialogue today, which is from Communities to Congress, U.S. Policy Landscape and Action for Refugees. And that's the key phrase, Action for Refugees. As you can see from our program, we have highly respected individuals with us today who will help us better understand the realities of the current policy landscape, especially at a time we are facing the worst global pandemic that significantly impacts refugees and immigrants. Today, we will collectively come together and share our gifts, our strength, and as well as our collective wisdom on how we might best grapple with one of the most pressing moral and policy challenges of our time. The significant decline of the refugee resettlement and then the transformation of the refugee resettlement to the executive branch, the inhumane treatment of individuals, families seeking protection. As we delve into our conversation, I want us to think of the over 100 million people who have been forced to flee due to a mixture of war, persecution, or other pressing humanitarian disaster. Please permit me to give you a humane definition of refugees. I came to the United States as a refugee from Sierra Leone in 2009. My family and I were forced to leave everything behind after armed rebels attacked my hometown. It was a day filled with tragedy. A portion of my hands was almost cut off and I got shot on my leg. My family house was set on fire with my mom's siblings and other relatives inside. Unfortunately, my mom survived, but unfortunately, my 7-year-old sister didn't. I lost my father as I watched him get killed. I spent 9 years in a refugee camp where I met my beautiful wife, Alima, and today we are a proud parent of 5. Now, our focus today will be on looking at local and national policies, how to build strong bipartisan support for refugee resettlement program, and return the resettlement to its historic norms. And we will discover and exploring our leadership across the aisle to promote and create policy solutions that favor migration and refugee protection that serve both national and global common good. And just bear in mind that we are going to be constrained by time because we have so many great people and so little time. So I'm going to be tough on time to accommodate Q&A from our audience. I will introduce our panelists very briefly. I'm afraid my introduction can't do justice to the extraordinary and impressive credential, but I encourage you all to delve further and read about their fantastic history. Quick reminder, there is a red mic at the bottom of your screen. Please, you can unmute the mic to speak, and then feel free also to turn it off if you're not talking, because I know that most of us are working from home. And as always, I'm guilty of that. Sometimes my son will just walk in, my little boy. And also, I want us to know that this is a dinner table setting conversation. I will ask the questions, and hopefully, I will ask the question to the table, and feel free to jump in to answer the questions. And if you have any comments, also do that, because we are having a conversation. In our midst today, we have Buwan Pierre is a former refugee, city council member, city of Reynoldsburg, Ohio. And also we have Reverend Dr. Sharon Starling Ree, Director, Disciples of Refugees and Immigration Ministry. We also have James Myers, the Associate Director, Immigration and Refugee Policy, Church World Services. In our midst also, I have my colleague with me, Nera Somik, Refugee Congress Delegate, Arizona, and former refugee from Bosnia. And then we have our representative, Athena Salman, the Democrat Whip, Arizona House of Representatives. Welcome on board. And then we have, last but not the least, Elena Rose Lettinen, Chairwoman Emeritus of the U.S. House of Foreign Affairs. I do apologize if I mispronounced your name. I'm terrible of that. So, and having said that, so now let's get into business and the questions. As we rightly says, with regards to the humanitarian crisis that we are facing now, and sometimes we're facing this crisis and we are not seeing action. So what are the potential repercussions for inaction, both at the individual or local community level? What could we expect to see as a result of that inaction? So anyone can jump in to start, and I encourage other members also, if you have input, to come up. But if within 5 seconds I don't see anyone respond, and then I will be prompt to choose someone. So the floor is open. All right, boy.
Okay. Okay. So thank you, Doda, and the team for organizing this. So my name is Bhuvan Pakurel. As I said, I'm former refugee from Bhutan. Before I start that one, I always tell one thing. I'm a former refugee from Bhutan. I spent 18 years of my life in refugee camp in Nepal. And I'm always and ever grateful to this nation for giving me a second chance to live my life. Because at one point of time, I was rejected by the king and its government, considering me as a less than a human. This country, people gave me a chance. Today, I'm a proud citizen of the United States of America. Last 10 years, we have done a tremendous job. It's my family. My kids are going to one of the best schools. We have a house, we have a cars, we have jobs, we have money in the bank, and we have investment. So pretty much whatever we call American dream is achieved in last 10 years, all because of the second chance given to me. So I believe people, those who are in the refugee camp, if given a second chance, they will be successful in this nation. And the history of this country has been formed and is all by the example of refugee and immigrants and the vibrancy and resilience. So that is something always grateful, and ever, 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 my next 10 generations will be grateful for this nation for giving a second chance. So to your question, what can be done in local, because I am a local representative, I'm a city council member, I have a power to do in my city, especially at this time, at least for the next 4 years. So one thing, what I'm gonna do will be on this coming Monday, we have a city council meeting. So I'm bringing a resolution to considering Reynoldsburg as a welcoming city. And that's one thing, action item that I am doing, and it will be supported by all the city council member. That's one action. And for other community members, those who are, especially those who are refugees and immigrants, in this COVID, this is real challenging, but whatever different capacities, this should be reaching out to their representatives, like from city council to state house to the federals, and make them a call that they support this refugee resettlement and refugee settlement, and they have to share their stories. I think that is something everyone can do, and that's one action item that I am doing as a person. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, the floor is open. Anyone can chime in? Okay,
Sure.
then.
Oh, please go ahead, Sharon.
Okay, James Maya, you can go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for this question. I mean, I think that the consequences of inaction are really dire. We're talking about people's lives, right? If local governments, state governments, federal governments don't do what's necessary, both in terms of the COVID crisis itself, but also in terms of meeting the needs of displaced people around the world, then people will die. People will continue to be separated from their family members. And not only is that a human tragedy, but it also hurts all of us, right? When we're not able to have, for instance, a nurse or a doctor continue their profession here in the United States, even though they were supposed to be resettled here, or they've been resettled here, but they don't have access to relicensing or certification, you know, that doesn't just hurt that one person, that one family, that hurts all of us, because we're all in this together, and we need that talent. We need, you know, everyone to be pitching in. And so I think that that's why, you know, we have seen some progress. You know, I'm sure Nedra will talk about the great success of Phoenix in particular in terms of the local support there. And there have been states, New York and New Jersey and Michigan and others, that have changed their licensing requirements to allow refugees and other internationally trained medical professionals to practice, Colorado as well. There is some progress, but it's happening not at the scale that it needs to. And we really need everyone to step up. And on the federal level, what that means is continuing to hold the administration accountable to resuming refugee resettlement and to rebuilding the program to return to historic norms, because lives are on the line and people are separated from their families because of these, you know, policy decisions that, again, impact all of us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Great conversation. And you mentioned about the impact, especially in the disparity within the health community. And this will take me also to my next questions also, which is, how has the COVID pandemic affected the local refugee communities? So.
I'm happy to answer that. Good morning, everyone. My name is Nada Sumik, and I am a delegate with Refugee Congress here representing Arizona. I think the impact has been tremendous. Locally here, particularly in Arizona, we're seeing a tremendous loss in employment. We're talking about between 75 to 90% of recently arrived refugees have experienced either complete loss of jobs or cut in hours. We're also seeing many are unable to access unemployment insurance due to the system just being overwhelmed. Others have difficulty accessing it due to language barriers. They don't understand, they don't speak the language fluently, and don't understand how to get through the system itself. We've seen other refugees and particularly asylees who did not qualify for the stimulus relief package due to ineligibility. And the last point I'll mention is we're seeing refugee organizations reach their capacity in resources, and including communities such as the faith community. People are stepping up and doing what they can, but it's very difficult when you have limited resources.
Thank you. Thank you, Nara, and especially, and I can attest to that. This pandemic, even before the pandemic, we see the resettlement agency here also, they have been downsized, and which significantly impact the refugees community. So yeah, the question is still open on the floor. So we still need, if you want to respond, please.
I just want to tag on to that really quick because Nana and I are from the same state, and coming from a state, I mean, consistently when it comes to public welfare and public education, Arizona ranks at the bottom because our state legislature has been defunding these institutions for decades now. But when it comes to incarceration and, elements that really puts the society into a criminal justice system, like we are among the highest states when it comes to the imprisoned population. So there is a direct correlation, and specifically because our systems were built are so outdated. I mean, we're operating off of unemployment numbers and eligibility rates of the late 1980s, early 1990s. Our Medicaid eligibility also is determined on the federal poverty level established in 1992. And so we're seeing this downward spiral, not only for the refugee community, but for many vulnerable communities in Arizona, where if you're lucky enough to be on unemployment, but you make more than $240 a week on a side job, you not only lose your state unemployment benefits, but you lose the federal supplemental benefit that is established through that. So people, and the other component is if you make too much on unemployment insurance for those families that are relying on, we call it, our Medicaid system is called Access. You can also lose your healthcare coverage as well. So I think that COVID-19, and especially the Trump administration, we've been down this path and this trajectory for some time, but COVID-19 really has exposed the cracks in the foundation, because it was a lousy foundation to begin with. It was virtually non-existent. And my concern with the refugee community, especially in a state like Arizona, is we don't build our unemployment system in such a way that considers the fact that a lot of this workforce, the specific type of workforce, hasn't established a year-long record of working, and therefore are not getting federal help, are not getting state help. And, I spoke to our local IRC back in April, and just within a month of the state shutting down and all the layoffs that were happening and the crises, they had already depleted their reserves within a month's time frame. So, we really are looking at a crisis, as Nada was saying, and there are a lot that states can be doing, but unfortunately in my state, it comes down to political will, and oftentimes we are, butting against a dead end and a hard wall, trying to get some of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to modernize these systems and to bring them up to 2020 standards, instead of relying on IT systems that are from the 1980s, relying on, poverty rates that are from the 1990s, et cetera.
I think I'm not saying muted, but we can hear you. Yeah. Yeah, we can hear you. I don't know if you're trying to talk. Okay. Whilst we fix the technical difficulties, and we will move on until we get, we'd definitely love to have you back and hear your contribution. But unfortunately, it looks like the mic is not working in your hand. I just want us to delve more on what Selma just said with regards to the lack of inaction, especially in states. And bulk of the refugees are resettled in states, and that's where the work is. In my state in Louisiana, and I've seen the downward of the refugee resettlement program. Yeah, at one point of last year, they only received one. So it is tough. So what can state government take to ensure that the sustainability of the refugee, not just the refugee population, the refugee program? What can state government do, and what action we think and we can take to make them do that?
Hi, Ileana. Great. You're doing a great job as a moderator, Dauda. Thank you. And
Thank you.
So many of the speakers who've already weighed in on this. First, I want to say thank you to Concordia, a wonderful organization that's the sponsor of this terrific panel, along with Refugee Congress and Refugee Council USA. Hats off to everybody. Like Juan, did I say that kind of right? I'm sorry. My name is difficult too. I was born elsewhere. I was born in Cuba and came to the United States when I was 8 years old. And we didn't have much money. We didn't have any money, but this is the land of opportunity. And we were afforded many opportunities to work and make a living. And finally, when I was 20 years old, I became a naturalized citizen. And like you, I'm forever indebted to this wonderful country, but it doesn't mean that we can't do better. And in today's Wall Street Journal, I read this number of displaced is nearly 80 million. Nearly 80 million people were displaced from their homes at the end of 2019, forced out by conflict, food insecurity, economic upheaval, according to fresh figures from the United Nations Relief Agency. And of course, the wars in Syria and in Afghanistan and all over the place, the Rohingya that is being persecuted, the economic and political crisis in Venezuela. I mean, we're going to have a lot more people impacted by what is going on in their home countries, and they want to come to the United States, and we've got to improve the figures. I was just reading last night that the number of refugees predicted to be admitted as refugees in fiscal year 2020 is 18,000, and that's down from 30,000 just the year before. So the numbers are, the need is getting higher, bigger, more acute, while the folks being admitted is going down. It's the lowest number since we had this refugee resettlement program. But you mentioned about COVID, and I think that it has really brought about, or can bring about, some good legislation. The U.S. House of Representatives passed the HEROES Act, which will expand the emergency Medicaid program. In this age of COVID, we really can't risk someone not getting the healthcare access that they need, because this will become a problem at the local level, a severe economic and health problem. So we're hoping that emergency Medicaid program is something that can be adopted in the coming months, because it's not about your social status or your refugee status. It's about really dealing with an emergency healthcare crisis. But we have seen how essential workers, they're now being talked about as heroes, and many of them are refugees from other countries that have made the United States their home, but they've been able to get their green cards or become citizens. And so I think this COVID crisis, if there's a silver lining, and of course, how can there be a silver lining with a pandemic? But at least we're recognizing the folks who are working at the grocery store, the folks who would never have gotten the recognition that they deserve. They've come from bagging groceries to being called essential workers and the health heroes on the front lines. So I think that's been an array of good news. But we need to work together at the state level, at the local level, and at the federal level, internationally, to deal with this pandemic, to deal with the refugee crisis, and to help people who want to make a better life here in this great country. It's made a better life for so many of us on this panel, and we're not any different than anyone who's coming and wants to contribute to the goodness of the United States. So I hope that we can make that happen.
Thank you so much. Definitely. Thank you. While I have you on the floor, Representative, I do want to ask, and I know I'm really how they call amazed with your history back, and I know you've served this nation well very long in Congress. And how do you see the current refugee resettlement policies compared to your time working on behalf of refugees in Congress? And that is one. And secondly, I want you also to tag in how can we best build, strengthen bipartisan asylum resettlement program.
You're so right. The key word is bipartisan. We need to once again get back to the times when we talked about these issues, not as favoring Democrats or Republicans, but as favoring the United States of America. And these are good, positive issues. And I remember looking at the debates between, some Republicans like Ronald Reagan and President Bush, and they're talking about who was going to be the best for refugees. And we've moved away from that, and I hope that we get it back and never lose hope. I think that good things are still going to happen, and we are going to be able to work in a bipartisan manner. And we all have to change the conversation and change the tone and change the expressions that we use when we talk about refugees. If someone loses their job, they're going to say, "Oh, you cost me my job, this person who just came yesterday." And that's just not true, and it's not borne by the facts. So change the tone, change the conversation. Don't demonize the other side. See what's good about the other side and work together. And we all have a responsibility to leave this nation a better place, and we can do it. And I'm an optimistic person, and I believe the best in everyone. And we just need to get out of that negative, partisan, nasty tone and think of how we can work together. Like in seminars like this one, this helps very much to tone down the rhetoric and the heat.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's a goal, yeah. Because the key is the human.
Dada, do you mind if I step in really quick? I think we have the Reverend back online, and I just want to test her audio really quickly.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Okay, great. Sorry to interrupt.
Thank you so much. Okay, Reverend Dr. Sharon, the same question that our representative just answered. What do you think the faith community will do in order to garner bipartisan support for this humanitarian crisis?
Thank you, Dava, and it is truly great to be a part of this conversation now. I wanted to weigh in as a faith leader to really undergird that whether we're talking about at the very local level or at the state level or at the national level, that for us as faith partners, what has always been true is that we didn't rely on there needing to be a law on the books in order to resettle refugees. For us, from faith communities, the inspiration comes from our sacred texts. I happen to be a Christian pastor, but this is true across the boards in so many different faiths, that it's the inspiration of our scriptures that calls us to engage. And to the representative's point earlier of this being both a bipartisan tradition and being such an essential moment for bipartisan partnership, I wanted to lift up that as my denomination, Disciples of Christ, we happen to have a 5-time governor in the state of Iowa who was in place during the time of the Vietnam era, obviously in Middle America. He was Republican. He also chaired the Republican National Group of Governors, but he was a person of faith first. And he spoke and motivated over and over, not just Republican governors that he was talking to or his Republican constituents in the state, but he motivated all of us to engage in every way we can as faith communities. As Ms. Salman was speaking earlier, and Ms. Sumik was speaking earlier, the needs that must be met, particularly during this time of pandemic, are monumental. The faith community in this time must show up as we never have, with our full motivation and with experiences of knowing. I know this was true in my own denomination and in many. We've been engaged in refugee resettlement for 75 years, not just for the 40 years since the U.S. Refugee Act of 1980 was established. So we need to use the creativity of partnerships that have been created, like agricultural sustainability project that one of our Kansas City churches runs with refugee families who are community gardeners, or others international models that we know of as well that have been deeply creative and have produced sustainability. But every person of faith often may also be an employer or a teacher who can help with jobs, who can assist with education, and we need to pull in the fullness of our identities to this moment to collectively move beyond this crisis.
Thank you so much. This is just a testament that we are all in this together. And I want us to delve more on this topic because that is one of the biggest problems of inaction. And whenever there's an inaction, it costs lives. So as refugees, or you work in a refugee resettlement agencies, what can we do again to build the best way to build and strengthen bipartisan support? So I want everyone to comment on this because it's a critical and thing that needs to be discussed.
Okay, this is Bhuvan again. So one thing I've learned, a few things I learned, I don't want to limit into one. Few things I learned last 10 years is we as a country always like to see the numbers, statistics. So one thing as a state we have to see is like, what is the contribution of refugee and immigrants to the local economy? We have to do that studies. Because once the study is done, we will have a numbers in front of us. I think the number speak itself, because we are just predicting here and there, like depending upon the social system, all those things. I don't want to say it here and there, but let's do some studies. So Columbus did a studies in 2016. Yes, 16 or 15 or 16, I don't remember exactly, but there were studies done. Contribution, local contribution of refugee and immigrants to local economy. So in that study, they found that 1.6 billions with the B, that is the contribution of the refugees in the local economy of Columbus. And if we could do that, those kind of studies by the states, I think that number will speak itself. That's one thing. Number two, to your earlier question, the COVID, yes, it is problematic. Yes, it has brought a lot of challenges. But remember one thing, when in the beginning of this pandemic, I don't want to say I was laughing, but I was amazed by seeing the fight for the toilet paper by almost all the Americans. We lived that life for 18 years without drinking water. We went through those things every single day. We did not fight for toilet paper. So once you see the life in the reality, how does the refugee and immigrants spending their life in the refugee camp, I think that we need to tell more. Because we did not have a toilet, forget about toilet paper. And those kinds of life we lived. And once you see this reality through the lens of a life, not as a number, perspectives will change. And I think we can make the change what we need. Thank you.
Thank you. What a very good point. Okay, Jen, I see you unmute your mic.
I was just really inspired by Buwan's points. I absolutely agree. And in terms of your broader question, Dauda, in terms of what can be done, there already is a lot that's being done that just needs to be scaled up, and other states and policymakers need to really listen to the best practices and to implement them. I think most folks are familiar with the executive order that tried to allow localities and states to ban refugees back last September. And we had 43 governors stand up and say, we're going to continue to welcome refugees. And 19 of those 43 governors were Republican governors. You know, we had more than 100 local officials say yes to refugees on a bipartisan basis. So there is bipartisan support for this program. You know, in Congress, there's the Bipartisan Congressional Refugee Caucus, which Representative Ross-Layton led, I think, every single year she was in the House of Representatives. You know, we are seeing bipartisan World Refugee Day resolutions, bipartisan resolutions commemorating the 40th anniversary of the 1980 Refugee Act, letters trying to hold the administration accountable to admitting refugees. As Representative Ross-Layton said, we're at an all-time low in terms of 18,000. It's an all-time low admissions goal. Compare that to the historic average, which is 95,000 refugees each year since the program began in 1980, right? We need a lot more accountability, and we need a lot more folks to join and to follow Representative Ross-Layton's lead in holding the administration accountable to even meeting that 18,000, because right now we've admitted less than 8,000 refugees, and there's only about 3 more months in the fiscal year. But one more thing in terms of what states can do, in addition to the executive order, you know, I would say, you know, there are roughly, you know, 4 things that states can do. They can increase access to education for refugees and immigrants. California and Colorado have both passed bills that provide in-state tuition for refugees and special immigrant visa recipients as soon as they get to the United States, which is huge. We need all the other 48 states to do the same. The second is workforce development. Maine introduced a bill. It hasn't passed, maybe it will in the future, but to create a fund to really promote the career development for refugees and immigrants. That's a best practice. We should see that bill pass in every single state across the country. States can make sure that refugees and immigrants can access the driver's license application in their own language so that they can get to work, so they can get where they need to be going. Utah passed a bill that did just that. And there have been pro-refugee resolutions on the local and the state level across the country, all of which, I should say, have bipartisan support. So we have a lot to build off of. There are a lot of tools in the toolbox that states as well as national policymakers can do. They just need to get moving on it.
Oh, and I so agree. I so agree with the speakers. And you know what you asked, what is the cost of inaction? The cost of inaction is deadly. It's harmful. It's putting people's lives on the line, and we don't have to have that kind of directive. We should be more of a welcoming nation, and we all have to be ambassadors for refugees, because most folks would, if you ask them how many refugees are coming in every year, to them it's, you know, 100,000 every month. You know, they think of it as an invasion, and we need to be prepared with the facts and the figures and say, look, this is the reality. Just like people think that the foreign affairs budget is 20% or 50% of the Congress allocations, and it's less than 1%. But people have the wrong conception. They have misconceptions about refugees, and we need to have fact sheets to tell people, you know, these are folks who are paying taxes. They're law-abiding people. They're not the ones committing the crime. People have these stereotypes, and all of them are wrong about refugees. So I think we should all be ambassadors for refugees, because we all came from somewhere else, whether it was ourselves or our parents or great-grandparents. We're all refugees. So let's get the facts out, and education is power, and we need to be better communicators about the good that refugees bring to this country. Thanks.
This pastor will add in an amen to what you said, and also to Juan's comment about the importance of naming the contributions of refugees. One thing we need to be doing is to be honest. How many communities, how many congregations have survived because of the contributions of refugees, because of the workforces of refugees in many different towns and states across the country? I think of meat packing companies, for example, that would never still be alive without that. I think of a conversation with a pastor who also works in Missouri with a company. It's a wind production company, and he said 1,000 individuals on his workforce are refugees, and it is impossible that his company could survive without them. So we need to be honest about how much is being brought in by refugees, and we need to be clear about what the financial ask is. We are grateful as faith partners to be pushing to all of our congregations over this World Refugee Day weekend, the World Refugee Pledge, and it lifts up that $642 million in additional funding is what is needed by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Without that very minimal commitment, the cost would be much greater. We also know that in an international perspective, our international partners who are shouldering oftentimes countries with the least capability financially to do so are carrying some of the biggest brunt of refugees living in their bounds, often small countries, right, like Jordan. And so we must hold, in faith language, we would say, keep our part of a covenant partnership and ensure that by investing in our refugee resettlement program in that amount, by supporting refugees in our communities, that we demonstrate on an international scale that we are indeed players of the world, that we are creatures of the world, and that we feel and carry a moral responsibility across the country and the globe.
Thank you so much. What a great way of putting it and everything. And I think it's a great topic, and it has been focused on states contribution, and I know for sure everything, even national, everything big at the states. Because our elected officials are elected in their states. So my next question is, and I will direct it to Representative Athena Solomon, and then anyone else can chime in. How can states play a leadership role in addressing the resettlement issues and influence national policies, and especially the 4 points that Jens Meyer clearly mentioned?
Yeah. So I've had the pleasure of working closely with NADA on building a statewide refugee coalition. So NADA should really dive deeper into that. But in a state like Arizona, I mean, let's just be real, right? We have a Republican governor. And in 2015, the governor was calling for a full halt on the refugee program, specifically because the refugees were coming from the Middle East. So, I appreciate that, Ronald Reagan in the 1980s helped establish the refugee program, but he helped establish it in the context of a lot of refugees coming from Europe and therefore Caucasian nations. But now, as we're in the midst of the national Black Lives Matter movement, and U.S. foreign policy and the Western foreign policy really has caused and forced people to flee their homes in the Middle East, in Africa, in Central and South America. We can't talk about refugee resettlement without calling out the racism that is so implicit in our global policy that has helped cause the conditions around the worst and most dire human migration crisis in at least modern history. So given that in a state like mine, given that the context, And so the governor was saying that in 2015. Meanwhile, Republican legislators were sponsoring bills that would defund the refugee resettlement organizations here in our state that were specifically targeting refugees. We had to literally start from basics. We had to, and you know, I give so much credit to Nada and the phenomenal organizing that she did. But as an ally, you know, I organized and helped hold my caucus together, the Democratic caucus. And I'll let Nada dive deeper into how we were able to affirm that Arizona's a welcoming refugee state, and some of the amazing work that she did with the Republican caucus to get that symbolic gesture on the record, so we can signal a new era of public policy that is inclusive and is supportive of refugees. So Nada, if you can chime in.
Yeah, and I think this is where it's critical. It goes back to that bipartisanship, right? Support. It's so critical that we strengthen bipartisan support by really engaging and building relationships with both Democrats and Republican legislators locally, right, and at the state level. And you know, during our Arizona Refugee Lobbying Day that we hosted earlier this year, we learned that the majority of Republican Party lacked education and awareness of refugee resettlement. And many of them had never met with refugee organizations. So our role, you know, as community organizers shouldn't really be to play a role of any type of partisanship, but it really should be to educate legislators on both sides of the aisle, right? And so here in Arizona, to Representative Salmon's point, we kind of had to start from scratch and start by building that relationship with both legislators and working with them to pass a welcoming resolution and educate them on what that means. In addition to that, we also started working, particularly right now during COVID, and engaging city councils and helping them understand what is happening right now within the refugee community and the impact also during COVID time right now. And because we were able to do that and do a lot of advocacy work, we were able to secure $3 million in the city of Phoenix, specifically for refugee COVID relief funding. And so while $3 million is not a whole lot, it's still a huge win. It's still something that went directly to our communities. And I firmly believe that other cities will follow. And they need to continue to provide resources to these communities because these communities give back a lot. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. And let's continue this conversation. The one thing I'm so filled with emotion because we're just talking about the issues of refugees, and we know that the term refugee, that's what a lot of people know. Well, those are human beings. And for us to be fighting for it every time and every day, it is tough. And this takes me again to the question again. And we have seen a significant decline in the resettlement of refugees. And as James Meyer rightly says, we start from about 90,000 plus average, and the current one that we have determination is 18,000. Correct me if I'm wrong. So what policies changes that we think affect that? And also, if you can recommend one thing about the resettlement program, what will that be? And this is a question for everyone.
I think we need, it's an excellent question. I think we need to have more participation from the business community to sell this idea that we need to get those numbers back up. That refugees are a positive contribution to our country. And I think that we've got the faith community, wonderful leaders like Sharon. I mean, they're there no matter what the faith community is. They've always been there and pro-refugee. organizations. They've always been there. I think the part that's been lacking, and no one has really brought them in, and many of them want to help very much, is the business community. So whether it takes place first in your local chamber of commerce or in statewide, and you build up to make it more of a national consensus. But I would like to see, the one change I would like to see in this conversation, not ours, but I mean the national conversation about getting those resettlement figures up to where they should be, they must be, is let's bring in the business community and have these leaders say, we welcome them, we're going to train them, we're going to make sure that they have good jobs, and it's not going to threaten your lifestyle and your job. Refugees are not the problem, they're not a threat. So I think the business community needs to be brought in. My 2 cents worth.
And I can jump in and say, perhaps I have less faith in the faith community than you do. I certainly have a great sense of responsibility that I feel. I think that it could unfortunately still be the case in too many places that the faith community, because they have known and have seen the refugee program functioning well for most of the years of its history, that there is yet a lack of a deep enough understanding of how decimated it has become in just the last several years. So, you know, our denomination has focused on doubling down on trying to continue to figure out how to make sure that word is getting out. I also feel that one of the two hidden secret realities of the U.S. Refugee Act of 1980 that we want to keep supporting and celebrating this year is that it also included provisions for our humanitarian treatment of asylum seekers as well. And I think it's important for us to always ensure, as we're talking about refugee needs, that we put them beside as well the needs of asylum seekers, that we lift up the need in this time to restore asylum protections as we see tragedies at the border, that we continue to try to prevent family separation and family detention, that we name where it has been happening in especially egregious and new ways during the time of COVID, including deportations of positive COVID cases, and take responsibility for that. So those are a couple of the things that I feel.
Yeah, I absolutely agree and want to echo those points. I mean, when it comes to the determination of how many refugees come into the United States, that determination under current law is the president's. It's the president's option under the 1980 Refugee Act. And I think that what we've seen over the dismantling of the refugee resettlement program over the last 4 years is that it shouldn't be the president's job alone. There really needs to be a better balance between the Congress and the president when it comes to setting refugee numbers. And one bill that we're really grateful to support is the GRACE Act, the Guaranteed Refugee Admissions Act, and this is a bill that would set a minimum refugee admissions goal each year at 95,000, the historic average, right? So it's just saying at minimum we should be at the average given a time that we're in the worst refugee crisis we've ever had in world history, right? So it's a very moderate proposal. The GRACE Act is introduced in both the House and the Senate, and it's one that we really would like to see Congress champion and take up. Congress does play a role. There are annual consultations with the chairs of the Immigration Subcommittee and the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. And so there are roles for oversight that we've seen, but we need to ramp up. But I will say, and I think in response to one of the questions in the chat function as well, in terms of what can we all do, where do we need to invest, what are the priorities, we need to invest in making sure that relationships are being built between refugees and policymakers. And so, I mean, this is something that Nidra talked about specifically, we've seen every single policy success, every single one, and I've been in this work for 13 years, has been because refugees have built relationships with policymakers. So that means that we need to invest in refugee leadership development, we need to invest in community organizing, we need to invest in training, and like the capital days that Nidra talked about that they've done in Arizona and that are happening in other states. Once refugees tell their story to a policymaker, they're powerful. Those policymakers are moved. A lot of things are not about changing someone's head, it's about changing someone's heart. And I think that that's what we've seen again, and we need to make sure that it's a priority for all of us.
Okay, yeah, Boyan, you can go ahead.
You hit the nail, Jen, and I want to echo Representative Eliana, right? That education is the weapon, because I would like to say we have to do three things: education, education, and education. That's all. Because I believe and I know both the things. 99% of the time, all this rhetoric is coming because of ignorance. If we put education over that ignorance, that will be gone. So that's one thing we should do. So how that can be done, because I know for sure education, how that can be done, is done on both the sides. One is we need more education on the refugee side, because we need to tell them, you should be able to tell your stories. Because when you go and talk to the fellow refugee community members, when you can you tell your stories? Oh, I don't have any stories to tell. What I was in the country, I was forced out of. I might have some of my parents. Somebody might have been raped or killed, whatever. I was in the camp to the U.S. They have no clue that that is one of the biggest pieces of their life, because they went through such a difficult situation, and they have been in the country and they've been they're thriving. That part is not been utilized by us. We need to utilize that one by encouraging, empowering, and bringing them up. Second thing is there should be more refugees should be in the advocacy level and run for the office, start making the change by themselves. Unless they are in the part of this decision making, that thing, how many more days they have to go and pray for them, can you please do this? Why don't you do? Because you have a power now. You can run for the office, you can make the change, you will be the change agent. I think we should do those two things in particular.
Thank you so much. And I do agree with the education. And I am a beneficiary to that. 3 years ago, I benefited from the Refugee Congress Leadership training sponsored by Touch World Services. Thank you, James Myers. And with a wonderful community organizer, Adamu, that training changed my life. That training empowers me, that I'm able now to speak boldly about refugees, resettlement, and advocating. So that training, singular training, empowered me, and I'm still continuing to train. So yes, education, and then once we educate refugees, we empower them, and then the next step is encourage them to engage. That take us to community organizing. And as refugee leaders, Nera, what do you think? I know we're running out of time, and then we're gonna move into the Q&A. So give our amazing audience also to ask. But as a refugee leader, what do you think the role will be with grassroots organizing? Because these are the ones that will move policy changes.
Gosh, the possibilities would be limitless. I mean, grassroots organizing, it's the power to the people, right? And I think it is critical that we get as many refugees engaged. To everyone's point earlier, we really need more grassroots organizing that be happening across the country, especially at the local level. We need engagement. We need people to build power and be present and be engaged. So I'll leave it at that since we're almost at time.
Okay. Thank you. Let me pass it over to Kevin, and then so that he will take us to the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Dauda. So for those that are watching, if you have questions for the panelists, please feel free to submit them via the Q&A. Our first question is for everybody. And it says, if you could give one piece of encouragement to refugee leaders, whether new advocates or experienced advocates, on how and why our voices can be effective for change, what would it be?
Well, I would say, building on that last question, and it ties into yours, that as a former elected official, I would tell you that this grassroots activism and getting people involved and knocking on the doors of all the elected officials and making that hard ask and educating the policymakers, that goes a long ways. And there's no one better than a refugee himself or herself to advocate for that change. So grassroots action matters, and that kind of support right at the local level to the member of Congress or the state rep or the state senator or the council member, doesn't matter what level, it really moves mountains. We hear, we listen, and I know people think that elected officials are aloof and don't care, but that is not the case. That's the old politics. That's no longer true. Anyone can have that power. People underestimate their power.
I'll jump in too, just to share a couple of stories in my life before working at a national level with refugees. I lived in a refugee community for a decade and a half in California and directed a refugee organization for over 20 years. And I remember one time, after months of organizing with multiple backgrounds of refugees, them going to our city council and having a tremendous impact on a vote related to the 10-year plan for the city of Fresno, California. And that night, one of the Hmong grandmas who had testified and had worked on sharing her vision for what that community needed came out. And as she stood on the top steps of the city hall, she said, you know, this used to be the city hall, but now, she says, I know it's my city hall. And I think of refugees who traveled from California to Washington, D.C. The elders, some of them were in their 80s, to testify to their senators sitting at the table with Senator Boxer and sharing their stories, those important stories that you all have talked about, of suffering and of commitment to take hold of hope now as resettled refugees in the U.S. and as citizens. And everyone's life and hearts are impacted when that kind of power is seen through the hearts and voices of refugees.
One action item that the question is like, starting tomorrow, I think tomorrow is Saturday and Sunday, from Monday, you must start going to city council meeting. Listen to that. School board meeting, that's very close to your house, very close to your apartment, wherever you sit. You must start thinking to go at least once in a month or whatever number of it happens. Third thing, now elections are coming up. Start registering to vote. Make sure that almost every one of us vote, because that the only right that we have is the only important right that we have in our life. For me, I made the commitment on the day when I was sworn in the citizen of the United States that I will vote every single election moving forward from the day that I was sworn in till my death. I made that commitment. I will do, I make sure I do, and at least I take 100 people to vote every election. Whether I run for office, I do not run for office. So these are the action items that every one of us in the panel and every one of us who are listening to this, we should make this commitment, we should do this. This is the action item I would suggest.
Thank you for that. That's actually a perfect transition to our next question, which is basically saying, what is one next step you can either do yourself or you can challenge either the audience or an organization or a company to do based on this conversation? So I think this is now looking at what can we take as outputs from this conversation that will help Concordia shape future conversations like this within this space. So challenge away.
I appreciate Concordia putting this together with the Refugee Council USA and Refugee Congress. These discussions lead to action. I don't think that this discussion will stay here. I think each one of us will be empowered to, as Vuwan says, to get involved, to go to a council member, attend the school board meetings. I mean, there's so much that can be done. And like I say, that people don't know the power they have, especially if you're grouped together. But one person can make a difference, because for many policymakers, they have a concept of what a refugee is, but they don't really, maybe they've never met one, and maybe they have met them all their lives and they just never realized it. So I think banding together and, like I said, bringing policymakers and business community together with a group like this, that can make a real difference. So we've got to get involved, and it's all about partnerships at the local, state, federal level, international. We all have to work together. It's one planet. And yeah, you're right. Get registered, vote, encourage others to vote. How could you not vote? That's such a glorious right that we have as Americans. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for this contribution. And if I can chime into this answer, I know I'm a moderator, but I'm just obliged to answer. Yes, if it was one thing, let's speak power to truth. And let's get involved. And I just want to encourage that the resettlement agency, especially local resettlement agency, to do more with regards to civic engagement. Yeah, I know when we come here, there are a lot of orientation that's in, and some local does ESL classes, but the foundation, once we set the foundation, because we transition and we coming from a different part of the world and we come into America and learn a new language and now learn a new way of life. If from that moment that we stepped in here, we have that foundation, if it is the ESL class that we go and we are taught about civic engagement, your right and responsibility, what you're gonna do once you get to those stage of the stages of stay here till citizenship, I think that will play a significant role. I've been in the US for 7 years, and that's when I know the power of civic engagement. If I had known that earlier, that should have might make a big difference. Because I'm saying this with experience here in Louisiana. For the first 7 years in my state, the refugee resettlement was like silence. Sometimes you go, when you introduce yourself as a refugee, people are asking, are there refugees in Louisiana? But I'm saying this categorically now in Louisiana, that's a thing of the past. There is no corner you will go in our city that people don't talk about refugees. The faith community, we target the faith community, we target the institution, the school. And because once you bring all this community together and you make the refugee resettlement issue a kitchen table issues, because once we target the kids at the school and they bring it back home to their parents and it discussed there, and then it reach to our legislators. So if you ask us what the next step, that's just what I'm gonna recommend, is speak power to truth and move the topic from inside your house to a kitchen table.
I love that. I love all the conversation of the importance of standing together. Southeast Asian refugees always taught me we got to be like bamboo. When bamboo stands together, there is nothing that can stop it from growing. It's difficult to get rid of it. So, if we were blessed with it, God created us with 2 arms, 2 hands. So part of what I would say to myself and to everyone in the communities that I speak with is build a personal relationship with a refugee, because that will be what educates your heart if you are not from a refugee background. But don't just leave it at the personal either. Make sure you use your other hand as well and put it into political action, hopefully in partnership with that refugee, attend those visits together, sign the refugee pledge, talk about the importance of budgets and what needs to be allocated so that the U.S. refugee program can survive, go on legislative visits and make sure you connect with your legislator and let them know that you will be watching, because for you to stay committed to refugees and asylum seekers, it's the law and it is our moral commitment as well.
Yes, I really want to echo that. I mean, I would say everyone in the audience can do 3 really easy things. Tomorrow's World Refugee Day. You can celebrate World Refugee Day, including on social media and in conversations with your family members, your neighbors, your friends, all of your networks. You can follow Refugee Council USA, Refugee Congress, We Are All America, which does incredible organizing work, including Nidra. You know, you can follow those folks on social media. They have great posts that are already going up for World Refugee Day. Engage in those conversations and stand in solidarity. Number 2 is you can call your member of Congress. If you don't already have your member of the House of Representatives and your senators, your 2 senators' phone numbers saved in your cell phone, do that right now and just call them. Whenever you have a moment, whenever you're cooking something, you're waiting in line, whatever it is, and tell them, I support refugees. What are you doing? Same with your local and state officials. Help build that bipartisan support. It really does start from people hearing from refugees themselves and their community members who are saying yes to refugees. And the third thing, and I hope this isn't too gauche for this conversation, but is contribute. You know, when we're talking about the Refugee Congress, they are doing incredible work with pennies, with a shoestring budget, right? These are refugees who are making their voices heard. Contribute to the Refugee Congress, contribute to We Are All America that's doing the organizing work, contribute to a local refugee resettlement office, right? These are the things that we need to do to stand in solidarity, but also to put our money where our mouth is, to make sure that we're investing in the capacities of people whose voices need to be heard by policymakers who are making these decisions.
Yeah, thank you so much. I know we're running out of time. The clock is fastly ticking, and I'll give an opportunity for each of our audience to give us 30 seconds closing remarks, and let it be a call of action in your closing. And I'll start with Buwan and down.
Thank you, Concordia, Refugee Congress USA, Refugee Council for organizing this thing. And I think this is really, really important. So one action item. Before that, again, thank you this United States for giving me a second chance and people like me a second chance to live my life. So the action item that all of us can take, again, I'll repeat the same thing. Let us take a challenge of registering 10 new people to vote for this election. Whatever, we don't care where they vote, but make sure they vote. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going with my screen. The way my screen is, oh, okay, I already see Representative Elena already on mute, so you can go.
Well, I will say to folks to get involved and become ambassadors for refugees. Everyone can move a mountain. The power of the individual is just, you just have no idea. And like I say, as a former elected official, I know what the folks in my district were talking about, what they were complaining about, what they felt passionate about. Visit, make appointments, ask, demand to meet with that legislator or that city council member, anybody. So the power of the individual has to be unleashed, and have everyone be an advocate for World Refugee Day every day. Gracias.
Thank you. Dr. Sharon Stein.
You know, I think it's helpful to remember over and over again that when the current Pope came into his time and his role, the first visit he made was to the island of Lampedusa, where hundreds of refugees were then and still are losing their lives through capsized boats and through atrocities that they experienced as they were trying to cross, especially from Libya to get to Europe. We must put ourselves in places and in human partnerships where we dare to listen to those stories and then to be informed by them to change our policies. And our American history has been built in part on the values of compassion and of restoration of hope and of religious and every other type of freedom. And we must not let that heritage be done away with, as we have seen our refugee resettlement numbers dwindle in recent years. We cannot be quiet about that. We must talk about the importance of it and restore that within the next year. And I say, I love Bhuwan's challenge. You take 100 to the polls. I'll take 100 folks from our faith community or more and make sure they are calling and visiting their legislators and seeking to change if we can, so that Congress does indeed have more of a sense of engagement in setting those refugee numbers in the future.
Thank you so much. And I will call on Representative Athena Solomon.
Yeah, and thank you, Concordia, and thank you to all the panelists for this amazing conversation. I personally have grown a lot from it. And, you know, I just to echo what the other panelists have already said, it is an election year. And I do believe that the refugee community and for those in the community who are eligible to vote, turning out and keeping track of how many people in your community are turning out and educating elected officials. We are registered to vote, and we do vote, and we participate. And then going back after the election to the elected officials who won and actually making them work for your vote the next time, right? You want to establish that relationship, and you want to build those communities and those alliances, because long term, we need better public policy. We need to have a city government, a state government, a national government that supports and really prioritizes refugees in the decisions that they're making. So, you know, again, thank you so much for having me on this panel, and I am so excited for everyone across the country and all the good that you're going to do this upcoming year.
Thank you. And that's Nera.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me as a panelist. Thank you everyone who for attending. I would say I would challenge you all, if you have not met a refugee yet, I would challenge you to go out into your community and meet someone who is a former refugee or recently arrived and build that relationship with them. If you have met a refugee, I encourage you to get actively engaged in community organizations such as Refugee Congress or We Are All America, where really the grassroots organizing is happening. And we need your support more than ever right now. Thank you.
So thank you so much to all our amazing speakers. And my last word, I will encourage every refugee, don't be afraid, diffuse the fear and tell your story, because story is the shortest distance between two or more people. It will shorten the distance. Tell your story. To our amazing speakers, what a productive dinner table discussion. Felt like we've been eating our dinners and everything. But I know that it's a breakfast time for us here in Louisiana. It's a lunch table, I would say that. Yeah. So thank you all. And to our amazing audience for joining in. If you have listened to our conversations and you listen to our stories and the wonderful work that everyone is doing to help refugees, if you listen to that and you feel compassion, I urge you, and I seriously urge you, to turn your compassion into actions. And I can rightly state all the action people say. Turn your compassion into action. 1, call your state representative and tell them to call your state representative to support the refugee resettlement program, to return it back to its historic norms. Secondly, contribute to the local agencies, national agencies that support refugees resettlement, and get involved, get engaged, get involved and get engaged. And this is an election time. Register to vote and vote. One can make a difference. So with that said, I thank you all, and I will pass you all back to Kevin.
Thank you all. Thank you, Dada, for facilitating this wonderful conversation. We will be writing a report from this conversation that will be emailed to everybody along with the recording of this, that will help determine how we continue having this conversation throughout the year and again at the annual summit. So this is not the end of this conversation by any means. So thank you for such wonderful action items and the lively discussion, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.